Welcome, everyone. I'd like to welcome everyone in today to our webinar. And if you will please take your device up to the screen and see that we have a QR code that's been posted up there. If you would please follow that to the sign in and to the certificate. Once the presentation is over, you can print that off. Again, for those of you that have not been here before, we are a nonprofit organization, and we rely heavily upon you filling out that information on that QR code. If you cannot use your device, I have posted in our, Lisa, they say they don't see the QR code.
Okay, hang on a second here.
If you do not have an access to using that QR code, please use the first link that is in our Zoom platform, and I will repost it for everyone just to make sure. It's a tiny URL. If you will follow that, that will also take you to the QR code information. For those of you that are joining on our Facebook Live, I will be posting out there in just a minute that tiny URL for you. So just bear with me and excuse me, we can do that. If you have any questions for today's presenters, Dr. Klein and Dr. Peters, please post those in either one of the platforms, either our Zoom platform or our Facebook Live platform. We will be holding those questions till the end. So please know that you may have hear the answer while the presentation is moving along once you do post your answer or your question. But know that we will address those at the end. So Lisa will be watching on Zoom. I will be watching on our Facebook Live. For those of you that don't know, my name is Jill Summerlot. I am the operations team leader here at InSource, and my co-host today is Lisa Paddock, and I want to welcome everyone again. Please enjoy the presentation today. If you have any questions, post those in either one of the platforms, and we will get to you as soon as we can. Lisa, take it away.
Hi, Jill. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for joining us today. I hope that the QR code did show. I did share it. There was some bandwidth issues. So hopefully it did show up. Otherwise, Jill has put the tiny URL and we'll show it again at the end because we do need that information. So as Jill said, welcome today. My name's Lisa Paddock. I'm Regional Director and Central Team Leader here at InSource. And InSource is the Parent Training Center for Indiana. So we have been around 50 years, and we are here to help families understand that special ed process. We're here to provide vetted information for families, community stakeholders, and schools, and to build those relationships. And we have a variety of information on our website to be of assistance. And today, I would like to welcome Dr. Klein and Dr. Peters and thank them so much for coming and speaking to us today. They are clinical psychologists for Riley Children's Hospital, along with other wonderful titles that they hold. And they're going to come today and they're going to talk about a topic that is extremely common discussion in families and at case conferences and with pediatricians. And that is about executive functioning skills. And what are they? What aren't they? How do we help with those? What are some of the things we can do to be of assistance? So at this time, I will be watching the questions. Please put them in the chat. Jill will be watching on Facebook Live. And I will turn this over to both Dr. Klein and Dr. Peters and thank them again for taking the time. And thank you all who are joining us now. And for those that will be joining us later when it's put up on YouTube. So thank you so much and take it away.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Jill. And also thanks everyone for taking some time to watch our talk. I'm going to share my screen, so bear with me while I sort this all out and get my screen how I want it. And then we will begin with today's talk. as Lisa mentioned, the talk is about executive functioning. I will just say before we start with the material, like Lisa mentioned, Dr. Peters and I, we both work at Riley Developmental Medicine as psychologists. We are not currently in the same physical space or even building for that matter. We're going to do our best to keep this a smooth transition between, presentation slides and all of that. But bear with us if there are any hiccups along the way. So yeah, again, thanks for being here. We'll get started. This is an introduction to executive functioning, which I know a term that has become much more popular over the last several years. So there's probably a lot of questions out there. There's probably a lot of good information, and there's probably some confusing information. And we just want to take some time to try to express our understanding of it and take any questions at the end. So we will begin. Here we go, with just an outline of what we want to talk about today. So we have two main parts to this conversation. The first one is, just trying to get a handle on what executive functioning is. We're going to spend some time talking about what it is, what it isn't, why it's important for our students and everyone, really, but with a real focus on students. And then the second part of this conversation will be looking at it developmentally. So looking at it over these three main age groups that we've broken down, right? We're going to start with what this looks like for the preschool age, then talk about what it looks like for the elementary school age, and then we've combined middle school and high school because of just a lot of similarities in those ages, and that'll wrap us up. So let's get started here. Begin with, we want to talk about just what it is.
Yep. All right. So yeah, whenever we're talking about executive functioning in this presentation, I just want to start and give the caveat that for the purposes of this talk, we will be referring to children that have broadly intact cognitive skills. So we're not talking about children that are struggling with executive functioning, things like that, secondary to something like an intellectual disability diagnosis. But here, I just wanted to start with a metaphor to kind of orient us here. So you can look at this picture of a super disorganized attic. If I were to ask you to find a very particular item, you might walk into this attic and be like, where do I even start? What bin do I open? I have no idea how to find this. As you're looking for the item, you might get distracted along the way and be like, well, I should start to sort these things. It would be incredibly overwhelming to find a very niche specific piece of information.
So when we think about executive functioning, we have to think about like just how the brain works in general. It does a lot of work throughout our daily lives, right? And as psychologists in the clinical setting, Dr. Peters and I do a lot of testing to try to measure some of these things. So one of our pursuits as psychologists generally is to try to define like cognitive processes and measure them. There are a lot out there. What we want to suggest today is there are a few key cognitive processes that we think about when we think about executive functioning. So we have a definition we're going to use today, and it's written here on this slide. We want to think about executive functioning as those cognitive processes that help with the intentional control of thoughts, emotions, and actions. So while the brain does a lot of other work, these are the kind of mental processes that help us attend to things, start tasks. They set us up for learning and completing tasks. Depending upon how much you read, there are a number of different skills that might fall under this criteria. We want to present 4 big ones that are pretty common in the literature. And so we want to spend a little bit of time talking about each of these 4. It starts with attention generally, or sustained attention. We also think about attentional flexibility, working memory, and inhibitory control. So to ground this a bit more, you can think about how all these things might be useful for an assignment. So if a student is given a book report assignment, they are going to be tasked with using each of these skills at some point to get that assignment done. So starting with attention, it starts with, can we train our focus, put our attention on this task of writing this book report, reading the book, doing the things necessary to get this assignment done, as opposed to a million other things that we could be doing with our time. And the second piece of that, which sounds very similar, is the attentional flexibility. So once we are engaged with that task, can we flexibly shift from one kind of subtask to another? So if we're thinking about that book report, it's shifting from identifying that book, maybe reading some of the book, to summarizing what we just read, to applying that to an outline. These smaller tasks that make up the bigger task, we want to have that flexibility of redirecting our attention. Working memory is something you've probably heard of here and there. This is our ability to hold small amounts of information and use them. So again, this is going to be applicable for that assignment. If the student is trying to work through this assignment of a book report, we're going to have to hold some pieces of information, including those that are not particularly or immediately relevant to what we're doing. Like, how long should this report be? How many sources do I need? When is it actually due? And then lastly, to round out our 4 skill areas here, inhibitory control. So when we think about this, we think about the ability to respond to our impulses and stay the course with the action that we want to take. So if you're writing a book report and you come across some information in your calendar and you realize that maybe that due date is a week before you originally thought, that might incite some anxiety, some feelings of being overwhelmed. And when we think about inhibitory control, it's meeting that and keeping it at bay, essentially, so we can continue with our task. So not letting that emergent impulse derail us. So again, yeah, attention, attentional flexibility, working memory, inhibitory control. These are the kinds of categories we use to think about executive functioning, though we do know it feels like they're very much connected. There's a little bit of overlap, but we try our best to separate them into these kinds of skills. When we think about executive functioning, it's also worth mentioning that these skills are dependent on our brain, right? And without going into much detail with the biology of this, which is somewhat outside of the scope of this presentation, I do just want to touch on the importance of brain development and executive functioning. So what we know is that the prefrontal cortex, which is toward the head, the front of the head, I should say, toward the front, is a part of the brain that helps a lot with executive functioning, right? And this is something that we know that continues to develop through adulthood. So of course we expect younger children to have more difficulties with executive functioning, but it's also important to recognize that even through middle school, adolescence, we're still not fully developed in that brain area. And so we can hopefully expect more development, more growth in these areas as we get into adulthood. Importantly, when we trace executive functioning back to this region of the brain, we have to acknowledge that it can be compromised. There's a number of things, and we'll get into this a bit more, but there are different things that can lower that executive functioning. Things like anxiety, things like traumatic brain injuries, things like developmental delays, including, I should say, something like ADHD, which is categorized as a developmental delay. We'll touch on that a bit more later, but just as an overview, I want to suggest that those basic kind of brain development principles.
Okay, so hopefully this video will work here. But we also just kind of wanted to orient you to how we might measure and assess for some of these different challenges or skills. So one of the more classic examples of an executive functioning task is called the Stroop test. something you perhaps have heard of before, but we're going to go through a quick example here if the video plays. And I want you to, obviously not out loud, or I guess you can in private, but you're just going to name the color of the word, not the word itself. So right now on the screen, you can already see that the word says yellow, but it's printed in green. So I would want you to say the color, not the word. Okay. See if it plays.
Ready?
Mhm. Okay, you can probably pause it. They get the idea.
There it goes.
Or there it was done. Okay, perfect. All right, so this is an example of both working memory and attention, because you have to hold the information in your mind that the task instructions, like I said, and you have to also block some information from coming in, because when the colors and words are conflicting, your brain is having to work a lot harder to filter out that competing or like incongruent signals that it's getting. So reading is an automatic task. Your brain just kind of does it without thinking, but the brain has to inhibit its ability and direct its attention to the color of the letters instead. And so this task, don't be alarmed if you're like, oh my gosh, this is so hard for me. I must have executive functioning challenges. Nope, this task is really hard for everyone, but it's designed to be that way. But the delay in your ability to kind of respond to this information is called the Stroop effect. And really, this is just, like I said, one simple example of something that you could see in a clinic setting. And we would be measuring, it's hard for everyone, but how long is it taking you to respond to this? If you're making errors, are you able to self-correct those errors? How can you inhibit those responses? What does that look like? Right. So now we've kind of outlined and defined what executive functioning is, but now we want to talk a little bit about what it's not. Because you might hear things related to executive functioning. Parents often will say things, like, I don't know, they're getting in trouble all the time. I don't know if they're just not trying or they're not paying attention. What is that? What's going on? So children that have challenges with executive functioning tend to elicit a ton of corrective feedback from others. They often behave pretty inconsistently and are getting a lot of input from people, pay attention, sit still, look at me. You could do this yesterday. Why are you not paying attention now? You can pay attention for a whole movie. Why can't you focus in class? But if you think of that disorganized attic, sometimes these children, they just can't get to the information that's in their mind. Maybe that part of the brain is just turned off or not working at that time. So for example, let's say your preschool child hits their sister. Their sister takes their toy and the preschooler hits them just instantly. You might say, was that a good choice? And they can correctly say, nope, that was not a good choice. But if you say why, they might often not respond or shrug or, I don't know. Is this kid being non-compliant? Not necessarily. Your child may genuinely not know why they made that choice. They don't know why they reacted impulsively and just hit their sister, because the part of the brain that said, hey, slow down, let's think about this. Is this what we should be doing? Is this how we should react? Was probably turned off at that time. Similarly, if we think about effort, why can my child remember some things or pay attention to things for a lot longer, but not others? Again, if we think about that messy attic, maybe that information was not stored or labeled correctly in their mind. So maybe the information is in their mind, but they can't get to that information to be able to retrieve it later. So if you think about a vacation that your family is planning. Maybe you spend weeks and weeks talking about the vacation. They're excited. You're talking about, all the things you have to pack. You're buying special things for the trip. You're talking about the travel. Once you get there, you're talking about all the things you're doing, how much fun you're having, taking pictures, making memories. And maybe their brain has labeled all of the information from that vacation as dust in Florida. But then when they get to school and they're being given information about World War II, they're being given a ton of information in a condensed amount of time all at once in one history class. And maybe they don't know how to label that folder because a couple months later, they get some information about Anne Frank. But where does that information go? Is that separate? How are they able to store it and keep track of that information in their mind is also really important.
So it's important for us to discuss just for a little bit ADHD and executive functioning. We know these two ideas, these two concepts are often paired together. They're in the same conversation. And they're definitely related. We want to make some clear distinctions here. So executive functioning, like we talked about, difficulties with executive functioning can certainly be symptoms of a condition of ADHD. We think about ADHD as a neurodevelopmental delay that is a part of a person's life from birth that goes with them throughout that life. It's a way that the brain develops that when we measure it as clinicians, we're looking for symptoms of inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. So it would follow that a child with ADHD is very likely to have difficulties with executive functioning. Those tasks that are necessary for maintaining attention and switching attention and inhibiting different cognitive and emotional reactions. You're going to see that. But we'd also like to suggest that a person can have difficulties with executive functioning without having ADHD, right? So if you think of executive functioning difficulties as symptoms of ADHD, a useful analogy might be how a runny nose is a symptom of a cold. If you have a cold, you're likely to have a runny nose. But you can also have a you can also have a runny nose and not have a cold. You could have a runny nose because of allergies or some other source. So again, lots of times when you're talking about children with ADHD, they're going to present with these executive functioning challenges, but plenty of children can have executive functioning challenges without also having ADHD. So there are other conditions also that have similar traits. We know that children with learning disabilities may present with executive functioning difficulties. Children with conduct disorder, I should say, children with autism, children with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. All of these conditions can come with executive functioning difficulties. So as I'm sure you already understand with the children students that you work with, like it can be difficult to parse out. But I think we're also trying to acknowledge that there are some purely executive functioning difficulties separate than diagnoses of ADHD, or like Dr. Peters just said, other things like non-compliance or lack of effort. Certainly there can be a cocktail of these things, but there are times when it's separate than these. So shifting to hopefully that lends some clarity to what executive functioning is, what it's not, how it relates to ADHD. But if it's still a bit hazy, we understand. It can be a little much to take in. What we want to talk about now is why this is important and why we spend time talking about it, why we spend time assessing it, and then trying to find ways to treat executive functioning difficulties. So we need these skills. We need these executive functioning skills in our daily lives. Certainly, at work we do, but we're talking about students in that school day. They're leaning on these skills in a number of different ways. So if you think about that school day, they're using those executive functioning skills when paying attention in class to the teacher. They're using them when taking turns during a game, just wait in line, when they choose to take a deep breath instead of yelling or throwing something. That's using executive functioning. When they get down and start a homework assignment, that's using executive functioning. So it's very it's called upon an awful lot throughout that school day.
So another famous experiment is called the marshmallow study. And I actually feel like a variation of this recently kind of went viral again online, of parents kind of replicating a similar thing of asking their children to wait for them to come back and leaving them in a room alone with a pile of candy and saying, but you can't have it until mom comes back, and kind of getting a kick out of how these kids respond to that. But there was actually an original study called the marshmallow study, which is a very famous psychology experiment that really focuses on delayed gratification and self-control. And this is really important in as it factors into executive functioning. And so what this study really involved was asking preschool children, or giving them a choice. So you can have one marshmallow right now, or you can wait for a short period of time, 15 minutes, and receive 2 marshmallows as a reward for waiting. And this study was looking at their ability to look at delayed gratification. So waiting to get a larger reward instead of taking this immediate smaller one. And some of the big findings from that study was that children who were able to wait longer tended to have better outcomes throughout life. So they had higher academic achievement later, they had better emotional coping skills, more successful social relationships. So this study was really kind of pivotal in suggesting that self-control and the ability to kind of resist those impulses and have that delayed gratification, those key factors of executive functioning, can be really predictive of later life success. So kind of dovetailing into that. So, executive functioning is just really important across the settings, whether you're at home, whether you're with friends, whether you're at school, as an adult in your career. But strong executive functioning skills have actually been shown to be a better predictor than overall cognitive ability, or IQ, for emerging reading and math skills. So executive functioning also predicts academic achievement in math, reading, and science. It can also predict job success. So those with poor executive functioning skills tend to have lower productivity, and they tend to have a harder time finding a job, as well as keeping that job that they have. And it's also associated with just an overall lower quality of life. So poor executive functioning skills can lead to some different challenging behaviors like aggression, emotional outbursts, and even crime. We can think about that impulsivity, or that inability to kind of resist that gut reaction that, okay, I just got to go, I got to do. And this inhibitory control specifically plays a huge role in quality of life. So one particular study found that children with poor inhibitory control compared to their peers when they were between the ages of 3 and 11 had worse outcomes as adults. So specifically, when these researchers followed up 30 years later, these children were more likely to be overweight and have substance use problems. They earned less money, committed more crimes, and were less happy on rating scales than those with better inhibitory control as children. Okay, so now we're going to kind of switch the focus. So as Dr. Klein mentioned at the beginning, now that we've kind of set up what executive functioning is and why it's important, we're going to talk about it across the lifespan. So we'll start with, what does executive functioning look like in preschool children? So it's there is so much variability in what preschool children can do with regard to executive functioning skills. Here on the slide, I just have some of the different attention span things that we might expect, or duration of attention span for preschool children, all the way from infants to kids up to 5 years of age. But there is a ton of variability in what we can expect at this young age, because not all children develop executive functioning skills at the same rate. Specifically over the first 3 years of life, executive functioning is kind of really overlooked because it's really, really hard to assess in this population. There's so much variability. But generally speaking, by the end of age 3, most children are able to start to use impulse control and cognitive flexibility in age-appropriate situations. But executive functioning in preschool children is still super important because it's been identified as one of those really big predictors for kids to be able to successfully transition to a more structured school setting. So like a typical kindergarten classroom. This is because executive functioning plays such a huge role in the ability to manage and organize our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors, while also being able to add in navigating that new academic environment. But as I said, in preschool, there's so much variability here. So broadly speaking, attention span at this age, at any age really, but especially at this age, depends so much on a child's interest and novelty. So kids really focus longer on things that they find new and engaging, which is why you might be like, again, my child can sit for a whole Paw Patrol episode, but I try to teach them to count to 10 and they're like zooming off. Developmentally, that's appropriate in preschool. But attention control improves with brain development and practice, and we can build those skills through play and adult interaction. But again, all of these things that I have up on the screen are just averages. So some children might have a naturally shorter or longer attention span, so much variability at this young age. With regard to assessment, again, there's so much individual differences at this age that we as clinicians, as psychologists, typically are not doing a lot of clinical or even in the schools psychoeducational evaluations for executive functioning or ADHD specifically at this age. A lot of the executive functioning measures that exist are not even really designed or standardized for preschool students, because so many of the executive functioning measures that we do have really require someone to have motor skills. There's a lot of tasks that require them to move a lot of pieces, move things quickly, or language, as we just saw on the Stroop task. You needed the ability to read. We couldn't give that task, to a preschool child. So there's not a lot of standardized measures for kids at this age, but there are some executive functioning tasks that are designed specifically for preschoolers. One I have just because it does exist is the Minnesota Executive Functioning Scale, but that's not often used in a clinical setting. It's often used in more of a research setting. Okay, but due to its correlation and predictive abilities for students with academic achievement, there's a lot of focus and a lot of emerging research on trying to help students develop executive functioning skills early. But the evidence on kind of what actually works is pretty limited still at this point. But a lot of the early and emerging research is really focused on a couple of different categories or ways to try to teach these skills or build these skills for students. One would be through just direct training, and specifically a lot of the research is focused on direct training of building up working memory and attentional control. So again, that working memory is that ability to hold that information in our mind long enough to use or do something with it. And attentional control is how can we focus on one thing and tune out or block out other things. So some of the initial positives from some of the emerging literature is that the initial studies show that if we actively teach these skills to preschool students, it does typically generalize, or they can use and learn that skill and apply it to a new situation, but only for really closely related tasks. So it's not kind of, if we teach this working memory skill, a lot of the emerging literature has shown that kids are still having trouble applying that information that they learned to a whole new skill, or a whole new setting in which they would need working memory or to focus and use their attention in a specific way. Other examples of ways that this has been studied to try to promote and teach executive functioning skills is through the teacher-child relationships, or just specific positive classroom climates. So teachers that provide a more predictable, supportive, sensitive, and responsive classroom climate can impact students' executive functioning skills. So specifically, there are some programs that already exist, like the Incredible Years, and that has been shown to have helped students in improving their attention and inhibitory control. As I mentioned earlier, play can also be used as a way to help them build these skills. So specifically, we can do things like model turn taking. You know, we have to inhibit our response to be like, it's my turn, it's my turn. We have to go back and forth in this game. We have to collaborate and work together. We have to perspective take, like, okay, it's not my turn, but maybe we can talk through and discuss, why did they make that move? Why did they play that way? All of those things. There are also different curriculums that exist that are play-based as well. There's one called the Tools of the Mind curriculum, and it has in this curriculum, teachers are taught how to introduce dramatic play themes. So children spend each day planning and acting out like different play scenes at peer play. And some of the early research has shown some benefits for executive functioning skills, but it's a little mixed. Social emotional learning. There are also some curriculums that already exist, like the preschool paths curriculum, and this really focuses on helping kids label their feelings, interpersonal concerns, cues for impulse control, and explicit social problem solving and like conflict resolution. And this has been shown to have some improvements in inhibitory control and working memory as well.
Okay, so now we want to look at elementary school years in the same kind of lens. I want to start by looking at some behaviors you might notice if there are some difficulties in this area, and then some ways to assess those skills and ways to intervene. So, like, I know Dr. Peters had a tough task of summarizing the preschool because there's so much change so rapidly in those early years. We're going to now focus on the elementary school years, and there is also, I should say, a bit of an age range here. So some of the things we mentioned, some of the things listed here could be developmentally appropriate for the ages. So you need to think through, more precisely where that child or that student is. But here we just want to present a few things that may indicate some difficulties with executive functioning. So you think about the home setting. If you're seeing just a persistently messy room, difficulty organizing their things, or difficulty following multi-step directions, having a tough time remembering all 3 steps to what you're asking, consistently losing track of things they care about, their belongings, trouble with changes to the daily schedule. These can hint at some executive functioning skills beyond what is typical. In the school setting, I think a lot of these are going to be recognizable, or what I mean by that is you've seen them in your settings, but consistently failing to bring papers to and from school, having difficulty getting a handle on that, not completing tasks or homework, forgetting to turn that homework in, trouble around planning school projects, showing traits of being impulsive, disorganized, or inconsistent with their work, and just difficulty working on their own, right? Needing more structure in that environment to have them begin, sustain, and complete that task. unlike that preschool range, we do have several ways to assess where those executive functioning skills are. There's a lot more choices at this age range. So one way to go about it is just simply this kind of observation, and you can make that as informal as you want, or as formal as you'd like. But teachers and parents putting eyes on the child, and you can go as far as comparing things like on-task behavior by the minute or every 5 minutes, and comparing that to another child in the classroom to see, do we have a sense of how often this child is on task compared to another child. There are also some informal questionnaires that can give parents and educators a sense of where those skills are. You can probably search for some things like this, but there is at least one in a book, which we'll mention again later. The book is called Smart But Scattered, and it's kind of a handbook, a guide for parents hoping to remediate some of these things. In that book is a questionnaire that you can fill out to get a sense of where your child is in these particular domains. But at this age range, we also have more standardized tools of testing. And everything on the right side of this screen, or at least most, have been standardized and normed such that we can find a score based on this measurement, or based on this tool, to compare to kind of the average expected level of executive functioning. So the first two listed here are rating scales. These can be filled out by a parent or a teacher, asking a number of questions that get at specific behaviors to see, okay, does this student land in that average range for their executive skills? Are they a bit above, or are they a bit below? And kind of a more nuance of like, here are the specific areas that we're having some trouble with. The Brief 2 is a big name in this. The Connors, they're on their 4th edition now. These are two pretty common rating scales that you may have come across, but can do a good job of gathering this information. We also have some tests that you would do, that a clinician would do with a student. Things like the Wisconsin card sorting task or the Stroop task. Similar to the one that we showed earlier, there are ways that we can actually measure performance on similar kinds of tasks that demand that kind of attention that you witnessed earlier with the colors and the words being a different shade or a different color. There's a test called the Tower of London, and there are a couple that we stuck on at the end, which actually are really great tests, and ones that you may find more commonly when you do tests of executive functioning. The DCAFs and the NEPC have a lot of good one-on-one tests that you can get a good sense of where that student is in different executive functioning. So next we want to talk about intervention. So once doing those assessments, whether informal or formal, we get a sense of where those areas are that we could use some help. We want to introduce some treatments, some intervention to help remediate that. There are plenty of ways to do this, so we'll point out just a couple, of course, without going into too much depth. But if you think about the things that can help in the home setting, one of the first is simple use of timers. Using timers and clocks to provide structure for expectations, right? You have 5 more minutes on this task, or I'm going to set a timer and this is what I'm expecting by the end of it, and having it like visually there, right? Something that you can check in and see. And then of course the auditory signal that the time is up. These things can help provide structure to getting tasks done. Visual schedules is a very helpful thing, and we'll be talking a little bit more about this later. Whenever you can either put in writing or actual picture schedules to provide the steps of what you expect, it's going to help scaffold that learning, scaffold that skill, help that child know, okay, I've done this, now what's next? And anytime, like, there's a wide range. These can be very simple in terms of just text lists, or you can add ways to mark them off, like interactively mark them off to go on to the next thing. these can be really helpful aids. We know there's also plenty of mass-produced workbooks out there. There are executive functioning workbooks designed for the children to complete to help teach them these kind of organizational and planning skills. There are also strategy books for parents to help coach them in how to introduce these skills in their homes. In the middle, just this box in the middle has a couple titles that I think Dr. Peters and I have both taken a look at and have good reputations. The one is ADHD Workbook for Kids. And I think that's geared towards the child using it. The Smart But Scattered, which I mentioned earlier, is I think geared towards parents more. And then something called Unstuck and On Target, which is actually a curriculum designed for small groups, but can certainly be useful in an individual basis too. So you might look up those if you have any interest in, and to get a sense of where to start with this kind of age group. Then lastly on this list is important to mention medication. Medication can be a valuable intervention for this, but it is important just to mention one or two things about that. So we know medication is often given for children with ADHD, and there are different types, I should say, stimulants and non-stimulants. And I don't want to, really get into too much detail here, but when we think about using medication, I think we always want to start with understanding that we also need to do some skill building. So whether you call that behavioral therapy or just teaching and building skills, that's going to be a component you're going to need to spend time with too. So the medication may do a good job in reducing impulsivity, but the child will likely still need intentional teaching of the planning and organizational skills to come up to par with expectations in these areas. On the right are just a couple of very brief ideas of how to change that environment in the school setting. We'll go into a little more detail in a minute here, but certainly if the child does not have any documentation with the school, those things can be developed, either 504 plans, or if the child has an IEP, accommodations can be added, supports can be added to help make that environment a bit more structured and provide a bit more reinforcement for the kinds of skills you're seeking. Additionally, homeschool collaboration, is always a good idea as much as it can be fostered. If you're working on something at home, it's best to make that consistent in school. Whatever reward system you're using, it'd be great to be on the same page. Expectations should be same. Anytime you can build a relationship with that classroom teacher, get a sense of what's going on there and communicate what's going on at home and get on a similar page, it's going to be better for that student in the long run. So here, this slide is just looks like 8 different things that we tend to see on the IEPs or 504 plans that we see with the children who come through our clinic. Some of these are pretty common. You may have seen these before. I'll just read a few of them briefly, but these are the things you kind of expect in terms of creating or altering that environment at school such that we help the child with these skills as much as possible, right? So seating near the teacher and away from potential distractions, like the window or a particular student that may be distracting. Subtle prompts from the teacher to attend to the work over the course of the day. Reminders not to spend too much time on any one item. There are some testing accommodations, like taking tests in a quiet room away from distractions, or simply extra time with tests. Things like taking short breaks can be helpful. Help organizing materials, especially students' desks and backpack. And guidance on how to break down tasks and large projects. And we know every classroom and every school is a bit different, and the way these are implemented are going to look different based on a lot of different variables, including personnel. But these are just kind of a brief overview of things you might see to help provide some structure in that school setting. Okay, so we do want to just talk through an example to kind of put a finer point on what we're talking about here. So if you think about the task of having a child clean their room, it would be great to just say, you need to go clean your room now, and in half an hour it'd be done. But lots of times, if we're thinking about the kids that we're thinking about with this presentation, that may not be clear enough, right? We might need a lot more detail on what we mean by clean the room. And so we have an outline here just to ways to break that down. But of course, this can look so different based on the home and the child. The point of this is, though, to do your best when giving a task that we're not independent in, to break it down into as many steps that make it clear and able to be accomplished. So for instance, let's say to meet your criteria for a clean room, we want to make sure that child puts their clothes in the closet, they want to put their toys in the bin, put their books on the shelf, and make their bed. Those 4 things, and it's a clean room in your mind. Okay, so let's list that out. Let's make a visual schedule, whether it's just a list of text that we can check off, or if we're talking about maybe a younger kid or really just any kid, a visual representation. So here is a picture of clothes and the closet. Here's the bin that the toys should go in, a picture of it. The shelf, how you want that bed to be made, a picture of it in the condition you want it to help, again, provide some clarity and structure to it. And this may not be enough, right? You may need to make more steps out of this. So underneath the point of put your clothes in the closet, you might have subpoints if it's going to be helpful for that kid to become independent. So you want to put the clothes, or sorry, the shirts on this shelf. You want to put the pants on this shelf, put the socks here, really itemize it. And then work toward independent and remove those steps as we become more independent in that sequence. Reinforcement, or reward rather, is going to be really helpful here. And there are a bunch of ways to make this elaborate and sophisticated. And I'll let you search for all of those. But token economies, stickers, tallies, candy, stuff like that can be used to help independence in these areas. And by the way, some of these things just may need to be demonstrated. So clearly taking the time to say, okay, when I say I want your bed to be made this way, we're going to do it this way. Pull the sheet across like this, put the blanket on top, put the pillows here. Okay, now you do it. You show me. Great job doing that. Okay, on and on and on. Again, just an example. This can look so different based on your expectations in that home, what that room looks like, all of these different things. But it's just got kind of a brief skeleton of that.
Okay, so now as Dr. Klein mentioned whenever we were setting up the presentation, we are going to lump middle and high school together, talking about those things. Part of the reason for that is kind of the presentation challenges and accommodations that we might see are fairly similar in these age groups. We spent time talking about preschool and elementary, but once we get to middle and high school, oftentimes these more nuanced or subtle executive functioning challenges become more apparent. I made the caveat when we started this presentation that we were referring to children that had average or intact cognitive abilities. And especially in that population, we tend to see these challenges maybe emerge or become more apparent as school gets harder. So think about your child, maybe they did great in kindergarten, preschool, elementary school, but once we got to pre-algebra, things got a lot harder because tasks and classroom instructions and things start to, academics start to build on top of each other at that point. So, you tune out briefly whenever we're talking about one concept, and then you try to tune back in. Do you have the brain power to keep going and keep up with algebra, and when those tasks build, okay, now you've already tuned out. Now you're trying to play catch up in your mind, those things. Also, as students get older, a lot of these challenges tend to look a little bit different and might change from looking a little bit more overt. Like maybe this child struggled to resist their impulses when they were in preschool. You know, someone told me no and I immediately burst into tears. I couldn't control my emotions. But now, as a junior in high school, I'm having more applied challenges. Like I keep losing track of my homework. I forgot to turn it in. I never took my books home to study. I accidentally left them in my locker. Okay. So here we have some examples of like the specific behaviors that you might see in middle and high school. So again, things like difficulty spending and saving money, difficulty completing college applications, because that requires a lot of autonomy, a lot of planning, problem solving, working through lots of steps to that. You know, you have to find the colleges that you want to apply for. You have to look at their specific criteria. Everybody's a little bit different. What all requirements do they have? I have to get all of my materials ready, to pay attention to the different college deadlines. There's so much to plan, problem solve, organize, keep track of in your mind. All of those things. Keeping track of a busy schedule. Now, maybe your high school student has a part-time job. They're also on the dance team, and they're, you know, a full-time student and trying to apply for colleges. All of these things. How do they manage all of that? At school, how do they break down large assignments? So if their classroom teacher was like, okay, we have a book report due at the end of this semester, wanted to put that on your horizon, they give all the instructions, but you know, it's up to the student to kind of break down that task to keep themselves accountable throughout the semester. How am I going to prevent myself from the night before this book report is due, like cramming and trying to spit it all out at once whenever I had 6 months to plan for it? So how can we teach these children the skills to break this down into more manageable, easy to digest steps so that we prevent that sort of cramming sort of thing? So we can go to the next slide. Assessment, honestly, similar. We don't need to spend any time really discussing this. The expectations and the norms, or like the standardized testing, the group that we're comparing to, obviously the expectations are different in middle and high school, but overall the actual activities, the recommendations, the way that we assess these things are similar to elementary school. So we don't need to bore you with that all again.
So yeah, a lot of these interventions are going to be similar to the ones we talked about at the elementary school age. Certainly there are workbooks for this age group. There are strategy books for parents. Medication, of course, is still in the conversation with the same caveat that I mentioned before, that teaching the skills are just as important. But the new one on our list here is behavioral therapy. Right? It's having someone work individually with that child to hone those executive functioning skills, right? Finding ways to reinforce and reward. The process is involved in organizing and planning and then completing tasks. Now, you know, different therapists have different strengths and weaknesses, but there are definitely some out there that are trained for this and can be helpful in working with that child one-on-one to build these skills, but also working with the parents on how to structure the home environment. I think it's also worth noting at this age, similar to what Dr. Peters was saying earlier about expectations at the teenage age range, is that, you know, teens are expected to be much more independent than the kids we've been talking about before. And that role as parent can become a bit more difficult in navigating this. It's hard to be as direct with that teenager. So finding a way to being willing as the caregiver and parent to help find solutions that are going to improve these executive functioning skill deficits. Taking that stance, taking that attitude is going to be a bit more helpful than trying to dictate such things. On the right side here is a list of the school ones. We have the same ones from before, the 504 plan, accommodations, IEP supports, collaboration with teachers, but the new one here is there are definitely things out there as schoolwork becomes more advanced. There are working memory strategies that can be helpful. There's a number out there, many more that I'm aware of, but when you think about things for specific subjects, like in math, there is something called PEMDAS. This is a working memory strategy, a thing that helps us with the process of solving a particular equation. PEMDAS is, if you don't know or remember, stands for parentheses, exponents, multiplication, division, addition, subtraction. This is a reminder of the steps one takes to solve a particular math problem in school. So instead of remembering each of those words in sequence, something like this acronym, PEMDAS, is helpful scaffolding for this skill. There's lots of others out there, but finding those mnemonics or those working memory strategies can help smooth out some of those academic lessons. Here is another slide that looks familiar. A lot of same bullet points as with elementary school, but this is a list of things you might find on an IEP or 504 that's going to introduce some structure to the educational environment. I think pretty much all the stuff on the left I said before, but on the right are a couple other strategies for this age group. One is simply having a notebook dedicated to things like assignment details, right? A place where the child can write down really important details about the assignment, expectations for the assignment, when tests are, when due dates are. Now, I say that understanding that it takes a certain level of executive functioning skills to do that task, right? To actually write it down. But if we're in a place where we can do that, this can be a memory support so that we don't have to carry all that information in our brain all of the time. So it would take some coaching, would take some work to get to the point of using that notebook, but can be helpful. And then this last point with the different subpoints is an acknowledgement that there are apps out there that can help with organization. As much as I am loath to recommend electronic devices, knowing how difficult they can be with attention with our teens, that is another topic for another in-source presentation. But they do offer some apps that can help with memory supports and just organization in general. So a few listed here are Wunderlist, something called Pete, and something called Audio Note. Feel free to check those out. We get no proceeds from that at all. Okay, and lastly, to kind of wrap things up, just another attempt to ground all of this. The example of giving a homework assignment to a student who has challenges in this area. We have teens all the time who have difficulty completing. We know they can do the academic work. We know that they are learning things in school, but when it comes down to a project, we're just having a really tough time starting it and finishing it and submitting it. So in this example, your child, your student has been given an end of the semester project, right? They're told just a month into school that at the end of the semester, they're going to have to present this thing. That's a big project. And we want to avoid them waiting to the very end, to the night before, to doing all of this work. We want to be very intentional about breaking it down. Similar to that bedroom, cleaning up the bedroom scenario, we want to do what we can to break it down into chunks. So divide that project into manageable pieces that we can tackle instead of thinking about the whole large project. We want to organize the materials we need to get that done, whatever the case may be, whatever the project may be, making sure we have those tools at the time to begin and start and finish that project. Assigning due dates for those specific chunks is going to be really important. So we know that the full project isn't due until December, but we want to get this piece. We want to pick out that book by the end of September. Or we want to find 3 books by the middle of October, or whatever the case may be. And then providing regular reminders about this. Okay, we had that deadline. How are we doing? Have we picked that book? Have we started the outline? Whatever the action item is, how are we on that? And then checking in on the progress, right? So I kind of conflated those 2 points, but they're very similar. Wanting to check in on the progress and then also provide reminders. Remember, we agreed that you would be getting this done at this time. Where are we on this? Okay. And then, of course, the same principles of reward, whatever that looks like for this age, finding ways to reward accomplishments is going to be helpful in learning that when we get things done, good things result. Again, same caveat as before. This is going to look so different depending upon the assignment, the home, the student, the resources around. It's going to look very different. But this is, again, a skeleton on how to address that big assignment. And so that concludes the material, the things we wanted to share about what executive functioning is, and then just a look at some of those behaviors and ways to assess and ways to intervene through those 3 big kind of school life stages. This is just a slide of some of the sources we consulted for this, if that's helpful or interesting to you. But now I think we're ready to just take any questions you have. It sounds like there have been some typed into the chat, so we'll move on to that phase now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Klein and Dr. Peters. This has been wonderful. This is something that we as parents and we as in-source staff helping parents talk about a lot. So it's great to be able to refer back to this. We did have someone ask about the presentation, which obviously you are welcome to share it with us and we will share it. But also I was explaining it would be on our YouTube channel. To check back in before very long, it would be up, and we will send that out to families when they call and talk with us about executive functioning skills. We send that link also to them. So that's very helpful. Someone did comment that one of the tools was now replaced by Microsoft To Do. I do see that. And then these wonderful resources that you gave, because you are correct in it's not as easy as saying, go clean your room or get your homework done or complete this project. And I really loved the picture, the analogy of all the different bins and the filing cabinets. Because many times I think things don't get started because we don't really know how to start. We're overwhelmed. And the more executive functioning issues there are, the more that might occur, and maybe we can help model. I do not have any questions on my side. Jill, I do not know about you.
So we did have a couple questions that have been posted on Facebook, and one is, what kind of therapy helps with this?
I'm not sure what this means. I would say it really depends on what the challenge with executive functioning is. Like if we're talking about a child that is really struggling with kind of resisting their impulses, again, we keep using the example of like maybe aggression, or it could be emotion regulation. Something happens, we fall to the floor, we're so upset, or we, hit our teacher when she takes my iPad time away. Traditional behavior therapy would be really helpful for those kind of things. What is an alternate way of thinking there? What is a better replacement behavior? How can we be taught to, kind of stop, pause, think, and respond in a new way? Or as Dr. Klein was mentioning, for the teens and adolescents or middle school, that might look a little bit different on the type of therapy that they're working on. Rather than behavior therapy, it might be counseling specifically to address executive functioning, or, a child that has an ADHD diagnosis might work with a therapist or counselor that's experienced and familiar with that diagnosis. And they might just do some problem solving techniques or strategies to address the specific problem that this child is having. Maybe they're having trouble keeping track of their assignments. Their locker's really disorganized. They are always cramming and, not planning or thinking ahead for their assignments. They might just work with their counselor about how to develop and promote these very specific skills. How do I use my planner? How do I keep track of all of my assignments? How can I organize my life? What does that look like? So it just really depends kind of what the question is, and maybe developmentally what age they're at or where they are developmentally.
Okay, thank you very much. The next question that we have is, are there ways to get help with executive functioning skills via a 504? No educational need to get an IEP, but needs help with executive functioning skills. If so, what accommodations would be helpful to add?
Jill, do you mind that one more time, just so I can process it again?
The questions are there ways to get help with executive functioning skills via a 504? There's no educational need to get an IEP, but needs help with executive functioning skills. If so, what accommodations would be helpful to add?
Yeah, I think there is absolutely opportunity to establish a 504. Of course, some of this depends on the need that the school is seeing. So I don't know if this question is coming from a teacher or a parent, more likely a parent. But certainly, if you're the parent, I would try to enter into conversations with the school about the needs that you would like to see met in the school. And I'm bringing up the slide here of some example IEP/504 accommodations. These are not word for word what we've seen on IEPs or 504s, but they're pretty close. Lots of times when a 504 is established for a child, it's going to have things like this. They're going to start with, I'm going to call relatively simple accommodations to see if challenging behaviors decrease. So if we've identified that a child is not doing well, is not on task very much because of maybe it's a peer, or maybe because they're looking out the window, or because something in the room is catching their attention, we might move that child to a desk closer to the teacher. And when we put it on a 504, it makes it just a little bit more formal, right? A teacher could certainly be within their rights to do that independently, but when we put that accommodation on the 504, that carries it with the child, that now we've recognized that the child performs better when they have a little bit more oversight, when they're closer to that teacher, and the teacher can provide those prompts, or there's just that, gravitational pull of having the teacher there, and now I know that teacher's watching me more, I'm going to be more attentive. That's just one example, right? There are others. Like, it could be written into the 504 that teachers should be mindful and provide prompts throughout a lesson to help the child continue on that task. Maybe some of the most common ones are the testing accommodations. So when it comes to those assignments that you're going to get a lot of points for in terms of your grade, like tests, we want to limit distractions. So it could be written into the 504 to give a quiet room for testing or more time for testing. But kind of go back to maybe the first point here is, if I'm the parent, I would want to talk with the teacher or special education staff or principal, whoever I have a connection with, to suggest that my child might benefit from this, and ask about the availability of something like a 504.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, that was the only two questions that I had.
Okay.
I do just want to remind everyone that we will be getting this out onto our YouTube channel, so you'll be able to access the presentation once it is there. Please feel free you'll be able to access our YouTube channel if you don't know how to get there. If you go up to the right-hand corner of our website, the YouTube icon is up there. You're more than welcome to go there and click on it. Lisa, do you have any other questions in your?
I do not. And I just want to thank Dr. Klein and Dr. Peters so much for joining us, and everyone for joining us today. And Jill, of course, thank you so much. And this is just a great opportunity to learn more about executive functioning skills and what parents and schools can do to try to help support students. We have some thank yous in the notes. Very informative. Thank you so much. So people are appreciative.
One last comment. Sorry. I put in response to that, the Microsoft To Do is out to date. Yes, it has been updated to Todoist. So I put a list in there, but on my end, it shows that it was only sent, that I can only send things to the hosts and panelists.
Okay.
I'm sure if it showed up to everyone, if you wanted to copy and paste that, because I have a broader, more updated list I put in the chat.
Great. And that should show up for Jill then.
Yeah, I can go in there and I will do that right now so that everybody can see that.
And I think as Jill's doing that, one of the other things to discuss at the school meetings are, let's keep things positive, right? Let's keep it positive. Let's look at the strengths of the student, and maybe instead of it just being a weakness, says, these are skills we want you to learn and that are important for you as an adult. So I just think being positive, capitalizing on, a lot of times kids with executive functioning skills issues are very funny, and they're delight for kids, but people get kind of frustrated with needing to follow them around and tell them to do things. But I think as all children, they'll learn, we need to make sure that it's as a positive environment as possible, and help those students actually focus on what the skill is. Do they need to break things down, right? Color coding, checking for understanding, some of those kind of things, and breaking down a project with a visual timeline. What are some of the things we can do? But in general, keeping things positive, so that, because no student wants to go to school if they feel like no one wants to have them there. So teachers continuing to be positive as they typically are, and parents and students looking for the opportunities to make things interesting and supportive at school. Actually, we do have a question. Do you find executive functioning variance in verbal receptive skills?
I'm not entirely sure what the question is asking. If the question is referring to, do children that have challenges with their receptive language also have executive functioning, or do those play a role with each other? I'm going to assume, and that's how I'm going to answer the question. I would say yes, those things can definitely compound on each other, because, for example, if a child has trouble with receptive language, they're having trouble understanding language. How much information are they able to understand? And similarly, as we mentioned with executive functioning, things like working memory, you have to be able to understand that information, to store it in your mind in a certain place, to be able to retrieve it. You have to also use that working memory to hold on to that information, to be able to actively work with it and use it. And so if you're spending your brain power just trying to simply understand what this person said, if it's taking you longer to process that information or understand what is being said, you're going to have a reduced cognitive load to also use those executive functioning skills. So those things can definitely compound on each other and make things harder. I hope that answered the question.
I think so.
And she did write understanding information spoken as opposed to written.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. And I'm dropping the tiny URL again, and someone was needing the certificate. Jill, do you want me to put back up the QR code, or would you like me to drop? Okay.
Yeah, that's perfectly fine. Yeah.
Okay.
Just as a reminder, if you're needing a certificate, go to that QR code, and if after you fill out all the information, it will let you print out a certificate for being here today. Yes. I just really thank you again, Dr. Klein and Dr. Peters, for being here. This really was very informative. I've heard you know, through the years, all sorts of things about executive functioning, but I have to tell you that this was kind of like my aha moment today because it was very clear, and the information was so well prepared. So thank you so much. I really got a better picture of what executive functioning is. So thank you very much for that. I don't have any more questions that have been posted on Facebook. I do just want to note that I did post in there on our Facebook Live the information that Dr. Peters had put into the chat box. And so that is that Google Keep and the to-do list and etc. And you will see up there on the screen that Lisa has put the QR code up again. And if you would please make sure that you do that training sign in and do that survey, that will give you that opportunity for that certificate as well. And we do have a statement that says, thank you so much, would love more information on this.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it. Thanks for having us, and I appreciate all the positive feedback.
Thank you all. And
okay, I don't see any more questions. Lisa, do you see any on your end?
I do not. Just many thank yous, and thank you again, and thank you for joining us. And Jill, as always, thank you for being such a wonderful co-host.
Well, Dr. Peters, Dr. Klein, please come back anytime you would like. We will appreciate any information you would like to bring us. You know that you're always welcome here. I want to thank the audience for being here today and those on our Zoom platform and our Facebook Live platform. Please come back and join us on Monday. We will have Monday Minutes. And then we will also have a couple of really good webinars in October on bullying. Okay, so I don't see any more. So everyone have a wonderful day. And again, Dr. Peters, Dr. Klein, thank you for being here.
Our pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thank you.